You know that you have fully healed your brain, that you have fully healed from your addiction when you completely lose interest. So when you're not trying to manage your addiction, you're not trying to manage your urges, you're not doing exercises or executing some plan where it's like, oh, if this happens, if I get the urge, then I'm going to go do this. Or you have basically all kinds of things in place to manage your addiction, to stay away from the thing you're addicted to. But instead, you just lose interest in that thing that you used to be addicted to. This is the goal that everything that I talk about when it comes to addiction on Quit by Healing aims towards. This is where we're trying to get. So everything I mentioned before, you know, the coping strategies can be very useful for the early stages. You're deeply addicted to something. You're, for the first time, getting yourself unhooked. You stop using. So if we take addiction to pornography as an example, right? You're using porn every day. And then you stop and you have all these strong urges. You have this deeply ingrained habit and so on. And now you're using your if-then plan, which I've made a separate video about. You're using the breathwork techniques, the nervous system regulation, and so on and so forth, in order to prevent yourself from falling into that autopilot mode and binging again. That's great. That's what these techniques are for. They're supposed to help you in the early, usually, let's say the first 2 to 4 months or so, where you might have really strong cravings and urges. You have all these tools at your disposal. That's great. But you shouldn't still be relying on these tools, you know, 6 months in, a year in, or whatever. To me, that is the difference between managing your addiction and doing what's sometimes called white knuckling, right? You're like white knuckle sober, which means you're holding on for dear life, trying to not relapse, versus actually doing the work to heal and get to the state where you no longer need the thing that was your addiction at all. Now, when it comes to porn addiction, I know that some people talk about addiction in a way that makes it seem like once an addict, always an addict, like you can't fully heal, you're always going to be dealing with this. But I strongly believe that this is not true. And I strongly believe that the human body, the human brain has a really strong tendency towards healing, towards health, towards getting to a healthy equilibrium. I also made a separate video about that. You can check out, I'll link to it below. So healing your brain from addiction is really just allowing your body and brain to return to a natural state of equilibrium. And the way we do this is you have to recognize the underlying circumstances that are driving your addiction and work on those. Often these are basically forms of emotional pain, possibly some trauma, and not necessarily like, you know, dramatic, huge trauma, but like little trauma. The trauma of, for example, being rejected or having a really tough memory of like a breakup, or even just difficult experiences with sex, which I'm giving this as an example because that's one of mine. You know, my early experiences with sex and relationships were very difficult and very unpleasant. And so for me, pornography was one way to escape that. Like I didn't want to face having to deal with something that was so difficult for me and wanting to risk the rejection and all this kind of stuff. And so instead, I used porn. Now, the problem is that we live in a world where it can be hard to imagine. Maybe you're hearing me say this, like a totally normal state of being would have you uninterested in pornography, not just not addicted to it, but completely uninterested in it. And you might think, what does that even mean? Or you can't even imagine that because the way you grew up and what you experienced took you so far away from what would be a natural, healthy state. So let me explain what this looks like. Let me lay out a scenario that will help you understand what it would be like to be completely uninterested in pornography. And then you have a better idea of what you're actually aiming for and how to get there. Plus, you'll also have a better understanding of what might be the things that happen to you that cause the internal emotional problems that are the driving factors behind your addiction. So by thinking through this, let's gain some clarity on these topics. So imagine this. Imagine that you grew up in different circumstances than what you experienced. And imagine that from early on, you had a completely different experience of everything around sex and sexuality and dating and relationships and attraction. First of all, imagine that you grew up with your parents being in a generally good and loving relationship with each other, with your parents being comfortably affectionate with each other. So you're seeing that role modeled as a normal thing from a very young age. Imagine that your parents were really good at relating to each other and communicating with each other and had a generally really happy and supportive relationship. So that right away, your imprint on what it means to be with another person, what it means to be in a relationship with another person is positive. You see this and you go, wow, this looks great. This looks like something I'd want too. And you're being shown how to do it. And at the same time, there's also affection there. So you see them being affectionate with each other and playful with each other. So again, you're seeing that as a completely normal thing. Now, right there, let's pause there and think about how different is that from the experience you had. Many of us grow up in somewhat or very dysfunctional families, right? Many of us, unfortunately, our parents have the same problem we have. They weren't shown what a healthy relationship looks like. They weren't given the examples and the tools to deal with conflict and so on. And so many of us grow up in families where people are like emotionally stunted or emotionally abusive or otherwise abusive, or where there's just like a lot of tension and conflict, parents nagging at each other, or divorced parents and so on and so forth, right? There's like a million configurations in which the initial imprint of the impression you get of what it means to be in a relationship with someone right away is way more negative than what I just laid out. And now, do you see where I'm going with this? Do you see how if you have a negative example or a difficult example, an example in your life from early childhood of relationship conflict and tension and problems, right away, that creates a totally different expectation when it comes to, at some point later on, you start to feel attraction, right? You get to your teenage years or even preteens, you start to feel attracted. You start to feel that inner drive is like, I want to be with someone. And we can call that the sex drive or the bonding drive or whatever, right? But that basically happens. And now the model that you got as a child will have a big influence on what that feels like. Because if you had a really positive model at home and you start to feel, oh, I'm starting to feel attracted to people, I want to be with someone, I want to try this relationship thing, that would feel like exciting and positive. And you'd probably have a positive experience with it because you've had such a good example. But if you come from a really dysfunctional family, then you're like, uh-oh, am I going to be in this situation where everybody's constantly nagging at each other and there's tension and it's unpleasant and so on? There's fear there. So right away, before you were ever aware of it, the way you grew up had a big influence on how you actually feel about relationships and sex and your sexual attraction to other people. So let's keep going with our imaginary scenario, right? You've had a good start. Now, at some point, you start feeling certain feelings. You start feeling your sex drive come online. And imagine that when this happens, you're never shamed or belittled or made fun of for your sexual desires or your sexuality. You're never, maybe you're taught things even at a younger age. You're taught things like, okay, you shouldn't be naked in public, right? You shouldn't like pull down your pants in public, but not in a way that feels shaming, It's just like, hey, we're teaching you, okay, these are the rules, right? For some reason in public, we wear clothes, but it's not with a feeling of, oh, don't do that. Don't touch yourself. This kind of thing, that makes you feel like, oh my God, I did something wrong. And then, like I said, once you start feeling attraction, maybe there's a girl you have a crush on. Imagine that you have maybe some older other boys and men around you who kind of help guide you, right? Who are like, oh, you have a crush on this girl. Okay, let's, who kind of take you under their wing and help you out. Even if it's just by listening to you. Oh, you got a crush on this girl? Tell me about it, And then maybe at a later age, can show you like, okay, let's figure out how to work up the courage to go talk to her. What should I say? Okay, well, give you some tips, give you some support. Imagine that you had supportive older boys and men around you who are excited for you to be on this journey, to be starting the journey of discovering this aspect of your life, and who are there to guide you and encourage you and help you out. And, and if you go and talk to the girl and she rejects you, or you just freeze and you don't know what to say or whatever, like they're there you can return to them and they're there to be like, it's fine, we've all done it. They tell their war stories of how they've screwed up in the past, and they let you know that everything's fine. Again, let's pause here if you imagine that, if that's how you had learned about dating and girls and all this kind of stuff, versus what was your experience like? In my case, my experience was filled with like a lot of like shame and tension and secrecy. You know, nobody explicitly told me this is bad, you shouldn't do this, but it was just like, it was like awkward. I didn't have any support. Nobody knew how to deal with this. I didn't have anyone to talk to. And it was just kind of, it felt like heavy and unpleasant. And with my, you know, with my failures and rejections and confusions, I was always alone. I didn't have anyone who could give me advice or give me any kind of support. And I bet for you, it was probably something like this. And maybe it was worse. I mean, this happened to me as well. I even got bullied. I got made fun of. I was kind of, you know, the kind of thing where I was made fun of, like, you think you're such a loser and you think you have a chance with this girl, that kind of thing, right? So again, these are some pretty negative imprints where later on, it's no wonder that around this topic of dating and relationships and sex, there's all this tension, all this fear, all these unpleasant emotions, unpleasant memories, which then I want to escape. How do I escape it? I use porn instead of trying to talk to real girls. So I'm talking here about the experience of growing up as a boy and having support from other men and boys. But let's also look at the other side. Imagine that the girls that were in your life also had a supportive environment and that in general, you were received in a positive way. So again, you were not shamed by them either. So even if you go talk to a girl and she's not into you, she's not going to make fun of you. She's not going to use that as an opportunity to humiliate you. She's not going to be weird about it. She's basically, because she too had positive role models and a positive upbringing around this, she will be able to kind of gently let you know, oh, I appreciate that, but I'm not interested. And then also, if you are interacting with a girl who also is interested in you, there's a positive unfolding of this, where your desire for someone is like welcomed, and you're welcome to be playful, and you're welcome to be experimenting, and you're not constantly in danger of making a mistake that can lead to terrible humiliation and rumors going around and people sharing, you know, your embarrassing messages, the screenshot of your embarrassing messages all over social media, and so on and so forth. And then imagine that when it comes time to you having sex for the first time, again, it's under circumstances where you don't feel like some enormous pressure to perform, or you have to pretend like you're not a virgin because it's uncool to be a virgin and all this kind of stuff, where you're just like, you can be totally real about, this is my first time having sex. And maybe the other person you're having sex with, maybe it's their first time too, maybe it's not. And it's just fine. And you're basically being accepted and welcomed. And it's not, there's not all this kind of pressure. It's just a positive experience. Basically, everybody involved is invested in making it a positive experience for you, which again means that you probably have people who know about it, right? Your bros know that, oh, tonight maybe it's going to happen, and they're supporting you and they're giving you the condom and giving you the tips and so on. And no matter what happens, you know, you can return to them for advice and support and so on. So what I've laid out here is essentially a picture of what it would look like if we lived in an emotionally healthy society, especially an emotionally healthy society around the topics of sex and dating. And can you see now that the circumstances you've experienced, the various, you know, shaming and problems and models of high tension, difficult relationships in your life, moments of humiliation, moments of fear, difficult, traumatic experiences around sex and dating and relationships, all of these things make it much more likely that you are interested in and get addicted to pornography. Because if you lived in this world that I laid out, where basically there's none of this shaming, there's none of these problems, you grow up with all this support, you grow up feeling like empowered, you grow up feeling like you are worthy of love and relationships, and that relationships and dating and sex are wonderful things, and you don't have all this emotional baggage, and you know that you can find people and interact with them, and you can have a good, positive experience dating, you can meet someone, you can have sex with them. All of this is basically an enjoyable part of life instead of a huge problem to be solved. If that were the case, how interested would you be in porn? Do you see what I mean? Yes, pornography is addictive by design, right? It is a kind of thing that hooks into our brains and overstimulates us and can create this addiction loop. But the addictive thing, the addictive substance has to fall on fertile ground for addiction. Otherwise, it just doesn't take hold. If you had no fear and shame and tension and all this inner constriction around all of this stuff, if you were generally a happy and fulfilled person with lots of support and a feeling of worthiness and so on, and if dating and sex were things that you can easily get in real life and have fun with, someone could show you all the porn in the world and you'd be like, you'd probably out of curiosity look at some of it and then you'd be like, well, some of this is pretty weird. And then you'd lose interest. This is where we're trying to get to. This is a big part of the healing process. So I've laid out the 4 pillars of how to completely heal your brain from porn addiction. And I'll also link to the full video on that below if you haven't seen that yet. The 4 pillars are habits, awareness, healing, and integrity. And the healing and integrity parts, especially those 2 parts, the second half of the healing process, is all about bridging this gap between where you are right now and how can you become that person and put yourself in circumstances that are similar to what I just described, where you are the kind of person and you find yourself in the kind of circumstances where you're just not interested in porn. You're living that kind of life and you have become that kind of man. This is a way more important part of the healing journey than the first bits, which is like, change the habit, stop watching porn all the time. Really, to me, that's just the starting point. That's the jumping off point. And it's the opportunity to say, hey, why do I have this problem? Examine your life deeply and make the changes that are so profound that you can just never go back to being the addict you used to be. Going all the way to that state, becoming the man who is completely uninterested in pornography, is, of course, a long journey. It's not easy to do, but it is very much worth doing. And there's one more thing I want to share about this. You're not just doing this for yourself. Because unfortunately, you did not have the circumstances that I described that would have made for a much healthier emotional life and much fewer problems and much less addiction proneness. You did not have the good fortune of enjoying that kind of upbringing. But if you fully heal, if you take this all the way, if you accept this quest and take it all the way, then your children will be much closer to experiencing something like that. And the more people do this, the more people can look at their addictive behaviors and go layers deep and go, I'm actually going to solve the core issue here. I'm not just going to replace one addiction with a different addiction. I'm not just going to replace one coping habit with a maybe slightly healthier coping habit. I am actually going to go to the core of this issue and I'm going to fix it. The more people do that, the better off future generations will be. That is all for today's episode. I hope this inspires some new ways of thinking and some new perspective for you. And I hope this opens up for you ways to see where the core issues actually lie and where you have work to do. And I hope it motivates you to do that work because it's very, very much worth doing, both for yourself and for everyone else. If you want to learn more about this, check out the first link in the description where you can sign up to the Quit by Healing newsletter and get access to my free courses that help you get unhooked from the porn addiction habit and do the healing work necessary. If you want even more hands-on help with this, you can also check out the Quit by Healing program, which is my 21-day program, which walks you through a very carefully designed protocol to unhook yourself from porn and heal your brain in just 21 days. I'll also link to that below. Plus, in the description below, you'll find links to my various other videos and resources. If you're not subscribed yet, make sure to subscribe. You can also follow the Quit by Healing podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. And if you have any questions or feedback, please go ahead and leave a comment. I try to read and reply to all of those comments. And that is all for today's episode. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.